just to recap, we've just asked Kelly and Ethan to tell us a bit more about their demands before we launch into the Q&A, but thanks for giving us an update, Ethan and Kelly. I'm just going to launch a bit of a poll to see what people think. So we've got here of school strike for climate's top 6 issues. Can you please choose the 3 that you think are most important? So there's multiple choice, but it'll be good to see what people think are the biggest priorities. It should be on the screen now. Is that working?
Certainly on my screen. Well done.
We'll let it run for a little bit while people make their choices. Interesting, there's quite a good spread. So it looks to be quite even at the moment. Investing in a just transition seems to be taking the lead. So that's good to see. We'll just leave those up on screen for a little while. So please do pop your questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear what you've got to say. I'm going to just have a look at some of the ones that we had during the session last time that we maybe didn't get to, and we can start off with those. Just bear with me 1 second. So we've got one here. Lots of people think that a zero carbon future is expensive as there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be in place. How can a zero carbon future become more accessible to all New Zealanders? I might throw that to Ethan and Kelly first to see what you think about that.
So I think an important thing to realise is that investing in zero carbon infrastructure will be expensive at first, but in the long term, the cost is actually, it's going to be cheaper. So yes, the upfront cost will be expensive, but I think at School Strike think it's like it's a cost worth paying.
Yeah, completely agree with you there, Kelly. And I also see it as we do have an obligation to be focusing on the economy, as any country does, but I think we also have an obligation to be focusing on the impacts that it's going to be having on people's well-being and the general population of Aotearoa. So for me, I think that the cost, although it may be high, it's definitely beneficial in the long term, and it's definitely needed to be able to transition safely and justly into a more cleaner and more sustainable Aotearoa.
Sorry, I was on mute. Rod and Lisa, do you have anything to add to that?
Lisa, why don't you go first, and then I'll mop up.
No, I actually don't have anything to add. I think it's wonderful to hear that coming through from this generation. Rod will have some words of wisdom to add to this, but I think it will be, this is just our reality of the situation we're in, and we have to find some good solutions. And what we have to ensure that we do is front foot as much as we can now, so that the cost and the burden is not passed on to future generations. So I think your assessment is well made, and it's up for others to do the maths, to do the the modelling behind how we as a country can make that work. Rod?
So hopefully this is coming through reasonably clearly, and if it's not, one of the team can shout me out because the internet's a bit unstable. But let me make several points that have become true. One is the costs that we will incur will be larger the longer we wait and the more abrupt the change we have to do. So in the Commission's work, we believe a just transition is about a well-signalled, well-planned and timed execution of a move off combusting fossil fuels in the open air and some of the synthetic fertilizer use. That if you make that abrupt, then you cause the kind of costs New Zealand saw in the 1980s, from an abrupt transition from a protected and regulated economy to a trade-exposed economy. So our pathway, and it's only one of many we could take to get to our targets, allows, for example, coal-fired boilers to stop being put in place very soon, but doesn't require you to scrap all the ones that you've got for a little bit longer. That we expect to stop importing high-emitting motor vehicles soon, but we don't run around with a crushing machine taking all the current ones off the roads. So the cost of the transition will be determined by getting on with it now and doing it in a measured and managed way, rather than kicking the can down the road and doing it abruptly in the future. Secondly, the evidence is that the costs may be lower than we currently expect, because new technologies evolve and are widely adopted faster than we currently plan them to be. And that's the experience in the UK, where they were able to drop the cost per megawatt of offshore wind from £600 a megawatt to £60 a megawatt. It's where we've seen the 50 kilowatt car battery fall by 90% in cost over the last decade. So we've seen it in mobile phones, we've seen it in all of the technologies that you are familiar with, where they have emerged as expensive initially and rapidly become much lower in cost. So my view is the costs will be lower than we currently expect. And finally, the benefits will be larger than we currently estimate. That most of the work the Commission has done doesn't put a value on things we know will be better in a greener, cleaner, healthier world. So we don't seek to put dollar values on the health co-benefits or the mental well-being benefits that we know will come. And the reason we don't do that is partly we don't need to in order to justify the action that we're recommending. And we leave ourselves a bit vulnerable if we have to include costs that are rather hard to quantify, even if we know that they are real. So to summarize, my view is the costs will be lower than we think, the benefits will be greater than we currently account for, and more importantly, we don't factor in a cost of inaction. And that cost of inaction may be reflected in a lack of ability to access valued foreign markets, a lack of ability to use developed better technologies, and the risk of being locked into disrupted supply chains for old tech. So I think we're on safe ground without dancing around on the source code for our models to predict that these costs are affordable. But we also make the fact very clear that the costs don't fall evenly across New Zealand society, and that those most affected and least able to absorb costs need to be supported. And that is part of a just transition too.
That was great, Rod, thank you. And I've seen that Ethan's popped in the chat. I definitely think that the cost of inaction is far more damaging than the initial cost to safeguard our future. Sounds like we're all in agreement with that. And we've had a couple of questions through so far. So thank you, Sean, for your question. What can the government do to combat climate misinformation? Ethan and Kelly, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah,
Ethan, do you want to go?
sure. This is a really good question, actually, because it's one that I think we sort of ask ourselves over at School Strike, how we're able to use our platform to cancel out the misguided rumors around climate change. And I think it comes back to obviously two things for me. One being that we need to see role models within the community really stepping up and holding ourselves and the rest of the community accountable for what isn't being done around climate change. But I think we also need politicians and our lawmakers and the government to be holding themselves to account and coming out, being honest with what they aren't doing, but then saying what they can do and what they're going to be able to do because then that's when we see a level of transparency, as we have during sort of the pandemic days, around what we're able to trust and what we're able to guide ourselves towards. But I think also, if we're looking at climate education, if we're actually focusing on implementing the raw reality of climate education within schools and the wider community, as I touched base on before, then I don't really see any reason why we couldn't believe that. If teachers are teaching it, if it's within the curriculum, if it's approved by the Ministry of Education, then what more education would we be wanting to see? So I think that by having the government holding themselves to account and actually be rolling out a decent level of climate education, we'll definitely be able to combat climate misinformation.
Thanks, Ethan. Did you have anything to add, Rod or Lisa? Any thoughts on that? What can the government do to combat climate?
At some risk of, at some risk of making mischief, you've got to be careful about what the government's role is in this, because there is a natural inclination for some constituencies to believe if the government says it, it might not be true. So I think Ethan's point about using social media, other advocates, role models, and leadership is actually really important. You cannot rely on messaging from central government. That's not to say they don't have a part, but one of the effective tactics I've seen overseas is where organizations put pressure on those who advertise in channels which enable misinformation to withdraw their advertising support. So that is one mechanism where you look at the channel that is enabling the misinformation, you look at how that channel is funded, and you put pressure on the funding sources not to enable that misinformation to be distributed.
Yeah, that's great. Does anyone have anything to add before I move on to the next question?
No, just that I think it's somewhat linked to the next question, right? It's how do we ensure that our whānau and those around us are well informed? And if I look at what's also going on with the COVID vaccine, there's a real lot of mischief making that is going on. And I mean, all I can say, like Rod, is look to what would seem to be a more reputable media source, but also really do your own homework and you know, look at all the different kinds of the types of information coming through, talk with your colleagues, you know, peel it back, analyze it. And I think that need to, how do you convince your own family members or close friends? You know, Margaret's point reminded me of an auntie who yelled at me at a meeting on the Marae a couple of weeks ago because she thinks she has to remove her gas that heats her water because electricity is so expensive over here. And it's really breaking down the myths and informing them well. For Margaret, you know, there's a lot of things we're using at the moment, whether it's podcasts, whether it's great documentaries around climate change. So social media, other mediums rather than just the local rag. And I know it's difficult, but you know, bring your friends in to help you with those conversations as well.
Yeah, that's really good. I was actually going to throw that to you first, Lisa, so that's great. But I'll just read it out for everyone else. But Margaret's basically saying she's really keen to have the conversations with whānau and friends about the need for action, but they're struggling. You know, sometimes it can be difficult with certain positions. So she's just asking for any advice on how to have those conversations that don't cause friction. So Kelly, what are your thoughts on that? I'm assuming you guys have had a lot of experience with this in school.
A lot. I think everyone can relate to having that one family member or friend who you just can't agree with on these sort of topics. So how I like to go into these sort of conversations is to remember that it is a conversation. It's not a debate. It's not an argument, and try not to go into it ready to convince them to share your opinion or, you know, convince them to start like fighting for climate action, because I think at first you have to understand your shared values. So it's likely that you care about the same things, you just have different ways of approaching it. And if someone doesn't believe in climate change, for example, it's probably for a reason, right? Like they've seen the facts, but for some reason they feel like they have to go against it. And that's not entirely their fault. So I think it's really important to realize that you probably have really similar values, and because they're your family members or your friends, they're going to give you the time of day more than they're going to give anyone else the time of day. And to use your sphere of influence to understand what they're thinking before you actually move into convincing them.
Yeah, that was great, Kelly. Rod or Ethan, do you have anything to add to that?
I might just quickly add in, because Kelly and I talk about this often, and you had a really good answer there, Kelly, because I often always get stuck in how I can talk to other students at school about this when they do generally have their borders up about it. And it's not always because they are against climate change or they consider themselves to be climate deniers. But again, it comes back to education. I know a lot of students who don't have the education behind climate change. They are afraid to embarrass themselves or not seem like they have all the facts together. So I think there's a level of empathy that needs to come in. And like Kelly said, it is just a conversation. So don't go in thinking that you need to prove your side of the story and that you're going to be winning points for this and that you need to come out as the better person. Share your perspective, but also listen to their perspective, because there's a reason that they have their perspective. And if they're willing to be involved in this conversation, then they'll listen to your perspective as well.
Rod, did you have anything to add, or are you satisfied?
No, I think you guys are right onto it. That the setting up the didactic "I'm right, you're wrong, you're stupid" is not going to get you where you need to be, and you guys are doing a great job of that. Explaining and empathizing is a way more productive conversation than the alternative.
Hey, and just another thing, it's a heart and mind thing, right? So get to the heart. I'm going to be a new grandmother for the first time, and I really want to make sure that my grandchildren and the children after them have a way better place to live in. And so, really start to talk to your family about your future and your aspirations and where you see yourself in 50 years' time. And when you start having your own family, what kind of world do they want you living in? You really get to the hearts.
Yeah, that's true. That's really good, Lisa. We've had one here from Robin. So thinking of education, it seems it's not widely known that the IPCC and the Climate Change Commission are basing calculations on a 1 to 2 to 1 to 3 probability of exceeding 1.5 degrees with a 1.5 degree path, with a 10% possibility of doing so by a lot. I think I've captured that right, Robin. Sorry if I've not read that right, but I think this is taking a huge risk with future generations on the planet. I'd be interested in Rod's comments. I'm not sure if does that make sense?
Yeah, look, no, it does make a lot of sense, and somebody's done a good job in understanding this. The estimated pathways that the IPCC have used have a 2/3 probability of holding temperature increases at below 2 degrees, close to 1.5 degrees. So it's all the IPCC is trying to evidence the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty about what's going on here, and they can't be predictive or prescriptive, and that gives you these estimates. And you are right to observe that, if we do all that we think we should, and we're not doing that yet, and we did it at a global level, and we're certainly not doing it at a global level, then there's a 2 in 3 chance that we'll get this thing to something that looks manageable, but it's still different from what it is today. Remember, we're at 1.1 degree, and we're talking about stopping it at no more than 2. And the most recent evidence is if we all do what we said under our nationally determined contributions, we'll get at 3, and not everybody is doing what they said they'd do under their nationally determined contributions. So it's all problematic. The challenge is we need to get on and do stuff, and then as it evolves, do more better stuff. But if we don't get started because we make the hurdles so high, and we scare the horses at the starting gate because they think we're all for revolution and that's the only way forward, the resistance that we'll get won't even get us started. And we need to get people on the journey. And then they'll begin to realize that it's a little easier and a little better, cost a little less. And I think that's when you'll accelerate the journey. But scaring everybody at the starting line, I don't think is going to get us where we need to get underway. So that the Commission's work has been to say, given the targets, so we're not debating the targets, either the domestic statutory targets or the internet, given the targets, what does New Zealand need to do in the next 3 budget periods? And then what is our nationally determined contribution? Because that's more than what New Zealand is likely to be able to do. And that will be met by offshore mitigation. In other words, financial transfers to countries that can do more sooner than we believe we can. But of course, how much we actually do will determine how much we transfer. And if we have more incentives to do more domestically, that will be good.
Thank you, Rod. We've had another question through which kind of links to what Robin was saying about worrying about the future and the future of our future generations. Christina's asked, how do you deal with climate anxiety? I think that's a good one. Ethan or Kelly, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I don't mind starting. Kelly, if you want to lead on. Kia ora, Christina. I think for me, I do hold a level of climate anxiety that I do tend to sort of shy away of or not face on a daily basis. But I think what's really helped for me is finding where you can use your voice. So obviously, I think Kelly and Christina yourself can relate with School Strike for Climate. It's a good tool to be able to sort of focus your anger and your anxiety on, and realizing that you're not alone in this. None of us are alone in this. And also acknowledging that as a school student, you don't need to know all the facts behind it. You don't need to hold all the weight and the pressure on this, because we don't know all the facts to it. There is still so much more research being done, as I'm sure Lisa and Rod can agree. Not everyone needs to know the facts behind it, because it is such a widespread issue, and it's an intergenerational issue where we should all be taking our own weight of it to be able to support and tōtoko everyone and towards that. So for me, it's being able to find the right sort of avenue to project my voice and focus my anger and anxiety towards, but also speaking up about it and sharing with other climate activists about my frustrations or why I'm feeling frustrated or worried or anxious about something, because then you can realize that, again, you aren't alone in this, and that so many other people are feeling the same way.
Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah, so basically, hi Christina, exactly what Ethan had said, and I think I personally am a bit of a hopeless optimist, and I don't know, I like to find the light in things, and I think for me it's really helpful to remember all the things that we have done. So, particularly in School Strike with influencing the zero carbon bill, and even just in terms of informing people, so people actually realise that climate change is an issue now, rather than 30 odd years ago when it was not recognised as much. So for me, it's just about remembering what we have done already.
Lisa, did you have anything to add? How do you deal with climate anxiety?
I actually have more anxiety about just not, my peers not taking the kind of leadership that they need to, particularly those who are in places of influence and who have an ability to assist with decisive climate action. We have a duty of care, I believe, to our next generations to ensure that we push forward to get the right decisions now. I'm really optimistic. We can do this. Our advice shows that we can get to that low emissions, climate resilient, thriving Aotearoa that we seek to get to. It's going to take just divisive action, climate action. Your voice is an important part of that. but I think also us in roles of privilege and leadership and positions where we can influence, we have a duty to push that on forward for you as well. And I think equally also pull out, look at, there is opportunity, you know, there is wonderful opportunity to actually change the way that we do things as a society. And so if you rather than focus on too much on the actual environmental climate impacts, start to have a look at the wonderful opportunity we have to really change direction. And I think that opportunity is not just going to have climate impacts, climate change impacts. There'll be a whole range of social equity issues that we can deal with through changing our direction, which is going to make Aotearoa a way better place. So really lift, you know, it's up to us to lift the people around us to be really optimistic about the wonderful opportunity that's also in front of us.
Thanks, Lisa. Rod, did you have anything to add before I ask the next question? Or
I just do a roundup because I think between the three of you, you've done a great job. I would say what Ethan picked up was my view about the way you overcome anxiety is by overcoming a sense of powerlessness. And that is about exactly the things Ethan's talked about, you know, engage, learn, share. I think celebrating success, which is Kelly's point, is actually really important. Don't forget how much has been done. By focusing on what has to be done, sometimes you forget where we've come from, and that's important. Lisa, the do what you can in the context that you have, you know, those holding leadership positions have, in my view, a much greater share of responsibility than those who don't hold those positions. And the way I deal with it is, you know, in 2050, I still plan to be alive. Sucks to be the rest of you, but I am going to be here in 2050. I want to be able to respond when my grandchildren challenge me. So what did you do when you knew what we were doing to the climate? And I want to be able to say, I did everything I could. And I think that's the only true answer. You can't do what you can't do, but you have a responsibility to do all that you can. So I think between all of those comments, it's a pretty good roundup about why despair is not a good place to be.
thanks, Rod. We've got another good question here from Sean. So what do you say to people who think Aotearoa is too small to make a global difference and argue that we should leave this to the responsibility of larger countries? Rod, do you want to start that one off?
Yeah, and I love this question because it's used by those who don't want to change as a justification for not changing. And the first way I'd respond is, there are 100 little countries like New Zealand. So do we all take a pass? And that's a third of global emissions. So that's not going to work, right? The next thing I would say is that argument could be used to say why every New Zealander who ever fought in a war wasted their time. We didn't change any outcome in any war that New Zealanders fought in, but we were proud to play our part and as a result, have a voice on world affairs that we would never have had otherwise. And finally, I would come back to the fact that any reduction in emissions is going to make the world a better place, wherever and whenever that reduction takes place. And finally, I would say that although New Zealand is only 0.06 of 1% of the world's population, we emit 0.17% of emissions, which is 3 times our per capita share. And it's estimated that our historical emissions are 0.3% of all the CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere today. So if you look at our historical contribution, we've taken more than our share of the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb this stuff. If you look at our current emissions, even if you set aside all of agriculture, because we're largely feeding other people, they're still twice the per capita emissions of India and China. And then if you look at our wealth and our technologies and our opportunity to reduce emissions, the fact we're little is not an excuse for inaction.
Thanks, Rod. Kelly, did you have any thoughts on that?
Rod basically said it all, but I think it's important to remember that whether you're drowning in 3 feet of water or 30 feet, you're still drowning. And so even though we've got, a tiny little place in the world, it doesn't mean that the issue's gone. I think it is important to realize that just because we can't make a huge difference to the world doesn't mean there isn't a difference to be made. Yeah.
Don't mind, I'll just quickly pop in there. I think for me, it's quite simple in terms of looking at how we've dealt with COVID. A lot of people have identified New Zealand as being world leaders in sort of this issue. And so for me, I sort of tend to ask myself the question, we have such a can-do Kiwi attitude within Aotearoa, which we've been able to direct towards our response to COVID-19 as part of the team of 5 million. So we can still direct that same Kiwi can-do attitude towards another crisis, such as the climate crisis. So I think it's all about attitude and where we choose to spend our time and energy.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I've heard a lot of people compare the response to COVID with what we can learn from that in the response to climate change with the decisive action. Did anyone have anything else to add before I move on to another question?
At some risk of overstaying my welcome, I would like to make a further pitch, which is actually it's in New Zealand's self-interest to reduce our emissions, because that will make our society a cleaner, greener and healthier one, irrespective of what goes on in the world. It will make New Zealand less vulnerable to the world's supply chains for fossil fuels, and it will make our own society more sustainable and resilient. So even if the rest of the world doesn't go about reducing emissions, we should for those reasons in our own interests.
Thanks, Rod. We've got one here from the last session. How can we ensure that the knowledge from workers in certain industries, such as the fossil fuel industry, be cherished and used when we're upskilling them into new industries? Rod or Lisa, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to start off with that.
Do you want to have a go, Lisa?
Rod, you yeah, you go, because you gave a really good answer to this to the West Coast Mayors and Chairs Forum the other day.
Yeah. So look, I don't think there's going to be any shortage of work to be done to transition from a high emissions economy and society to a low emissions economy. There is lots of work out there. And it's work across the broad spectrum of skills and capabilities, aptitudes and interests that New Zealanders have. Take some real examples of where the new work will be. We have got a massive new industry to build in the propagation, planting, protection and management of native forests as permanent carbon sinks. That's basically a $500 million a year new industry we have to build. And it's not just about people planting trees. It's about the science. It's about the management. It's about the measurement and monitoring to make sure that what we plant, we actually preserve. We go from there and think about, okay, well, there are going to be less jobs in the searching for, extraction of, processing and delivery of coal, oil and gas. But there are going to be massive numbers of jobs created in the development of the electricity grid, the building of the renewables infrastructure, wind turbines, solar arrays, the connecting of new types of devices, heat pumps, EVs and e-mobility devices. So those are skills that go from the highly complex electrical engineering right down to the guy with the screwdriver who actually makes stuff work every day. If you then look at what we think about how we're going to have to live in urban environments that facilitate more shared mobility, there are going to be jobs in creating and supporting that shared mobility that displace some of the owner-occupier self-driven vehicles and opportunities. And the list is quite long, and partly that's why the impact on our gross domestic product is not as great as some people might have thought. We're going to displace $4 billion of money we pay to other people for their oil by stuff that we build and use and maintain in New Zealand to generate electricity. So I think we are going to have more work to do than we have skills to do it. I heard a very specific example yesterday from a big energy company that's announced they're bringing in a new geothermal field in Taranaki, right? So contact energy. They've drilled 90 of the 130 wells they need. And the people who are drilling them are the guys with the technical skills who used to drill for oil and gas. So, there will be those substitutions of using my current skills to do different work, but there'll also be the need to build new skills to do new work. I think we've got lots of work to do here.
Thanks, Rod. Does anyone have anything to add on that? No? We've had another good question come through from Alicia. I'm finding a lot of people, even those in the climate space, have not yet read or engaged with the report. How can we make it more accessible? Whose responsibility is this? Ethan and Kelly, I know you've been doing a lot on making this more accessible, so it'd be good to hear from you how you've been finding that.
Yeah, so we've done quite a lot of work around sort of simplifying the report, and we've been working with a few other organizations on making a template for the public to be able to go and take sort of some key points from, put it into their own sort of submission. But before we talk about that, I think from my perspective, there is a push from government, more so central government. I've seen the Greens and the Labour Party have put a push on getting people to submit. For instance, the Greens have made their own submission template, like the one that we've made, and pushing for the public to submit to that, as well as the Labour Party pushing for people to actually go use those types of submission templates to submit. So I think that there is a good focus from sort of central government, but I think that there does tend to be a key role within the media. I think there is a lot of media that choose when and how they'd like to focus on the issue of climate change. And we saw when this report came out, there was a huge focus on it, but it sort of fizzled out over time. So I'm hoping that within the few weeks or the week leading up to when submissions close, we will see another focus from the media's point of view. But from groups such as School Strike for Climate, we've all put together our efforts into making and producing a template, which you can go have a look at our social medias like Facebook and Instagram, that's where it all is, or on our website. And there's a nice sort of overview on our stance on this, on the report, as well as a link to the template where you can go and take key points out of and put in your personal sort of feedback towards the report.
Thanks, Ethan. Have you had quite a good response to that so far then?
Yes, we have. I was looking at it last night because we can see sort of how many people have been on the template, and we're having a really good response to it. And it looks like a lot of people are finding the accessibility quite well. But we are going to continue putting a big push on it because we need as many people submitting to it as possible. Because again, this is an opportunity that can't be missed. It's shaping the future all the way up to 2050. It's the public's opportunity to finally get their voice heard and what they want from the government and where they see the future of Aotearoa. So we really need to be making sure everyone submits to this and gets their feedback in.
Thanks, Ethan. Kelly, did you have anything to add? Or
I was just going to plug our social media where we've put up the shortened version of the report. That was actually really helpful for most of my friends who didn't want to read the full report but wanted to inform themselves. So yeah, check that out.
Yeah, it's a really useful tool. I'm not sure if we know the answer to this off the top of our heads, but on the back of that, in terms of encouraging people to make submissions, Kathleen has asked how many submissions we've received to date, but says thank you for extending the time frame. So I think I'm glad that people are pleased that we've been able to give them more time to respond, because obviously it's a big important piece of work. I don't actually have those numbers to hand. I'm not sure, Rod or Lisa, if you do either, but I think we've had quite a few come through so far.
I know as of yesterday, yeah. As of yesterday, it was over 650, and that didn't count the 250 that had come as a result of the Green Party push.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, it's good to know. We've had another question through from Sean. Is the report the final step in the process to reaching our targets? What happens next? That's a good question. Rod, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we finalise our report and submit it to the Minister by the 31st of May. The Minister then has essentially a very short period of time to table it in the House, and given the House will be sitting on the 1st of June, it's likely it'll get tabled in the House within the first 10 days of June. Then the government's got until the 31st of December to essentially regulate for emissions budgets and an emission reduction plan. And I think they're going to want to do that sooner, because the first 2 weeks in November is a conference of the parties to the Paris Agreement, which happens in Glasgow. And I suspect they're going to want to go to Glasgow and say, here are our emissions budgets, this is our emissions reduction plan, and here is our nationally determined contribution. So I suspect they're going to have to move quite quickly in June, July, August, September, October to turn up in November in Glasgow.
Yeah. I think we've not had any new questions through just yet. So I wondered if Ethan or Kelly, was there anything in particular you wanted to ask Rod and Lisa while we're all together?
I had a point that I sort of wanted to add on to the previous question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rod or Lisa, but I think what's also really valuable to know is, regardless of this report, climate action still needs to be, seen within the community. The government is still able to act on the climate crisis that we face, regardless of when this report's finalised, when submissions are due, however long they have to act on the report. So regardless of what's in this report, they can still make climate action. And so it's within community groups like School Strike for Climate and other like-minded community groups to be pressuring the government to be making that change, and to be letting people know that this report doesn't stop them from pursuing more action or reducing what they're already wanting to do. It's totally up to them. And again, like everyone's seen, they can totally dismiss this report if they wanted to, and the advice that's given in it. So I think it's also up to us within the community to be letting the government know that we still want to see more action regardless of what's in this report.
Yep. Absolutely correct. That the Climate Change Commission, are tasked with a particular subset of things we advise the government on, and they can do anything they want to do, not only what we say they could do.
Yeah, that's really good. I think you've already answered this a little bit.
And can I just add, Kylie, to our young folk that it's not just the government who need to hear your voice at a central government level, it's also local government. It's the business sector. A lot of them can start taking climate action now without any policy. We know what's ahead of us. Everyone has a good idea of where things are going to head to. And so your voice is important, not just to be heard by government, but to be heard at a local government level and also across the business sector.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That's really important. We've got 10 more minutes, so I'll just ask a question from last time before we wrap up, unless we get any others through. I think Ethan and Kelly, you've sort of talked about this a little bit, but how can we support greater voices from youth and other groups that aren't necessarily don't have as big a voice to respond to the climate change report and beyond? What's your experience with sort of your age group getting them engaged with this report?
Yeah, I might quickly start that one off, and Kelly, if you wanted to expand. I know from School Strike's perspective, a lot of our regional team have been holding submission nights. So you'll get the community to come along and high school students to come along, and you'll have maybe a few of our School Strike members detailing what's in the report, why we need to be submitting, and then you'll spend the rest of the night going around and individually submitting to that report yourself. But I think for me, there has been a good engagement of the response to the report, but it's now a matter of actually getting the youth to be submitting to that report, because we all hold sort of similar viewpoints or frustrations around climate action and climate justice, which isn't highly being seen from a central government perspective. So actually being able to convince and motivate like-minded youth within the population of Aotearoa to sit down and take the time to submit and thoroughly read over whether it's the simplified report that we've produced or actually going into the real report and looking at it in detail could be quite valuable.
I would also make some observations. There are some very specific recommendations that if young people throw their weight behind, are more likely to get adopted, and if your weight is evidenced by its absence, are more likely not to be followed. And one of them is the establishment of essentially a standing forum where those communities in New Zealand less likely to be heard on climate policy and climate action will essentially have a permanent voice. I would strongly recommend you look at that recommendation, and if you like it, throw your weight behind it, because that is likely to be picked up if it's seen as being a way of getting more inclusive public participation on an ongoing basis. Secondly, we've got a recommendation that we know that the cost of buying cars new to New Zealand will increase in the decade ahead. The cars will be better, they will be less emitting and lower cost to operate, but they will cost more. That's partly why we've recommended free public transport for everybody under the age of 25. But you may want to think about what are the other interventions to support mobility for young people who may in the next decade not have access to those really cheap but nasty, emitting and unsafe cars that we've spread all over New Zealand in the last 30 years. So there are two areas that directly impact your lives: transport, mobility, and also voice through a public forum. But I'm sure there's lots of other parts of the report where you can dig down into.
Thanks, Rod. We've had a good question through from Kathleen as well. Beyond this report, will there be other tasks that the Climate Change Commission is assigned to? We were discussing a regional and national accountability tracker. Is this something that you will be able to provide, so we know how the government is progressing?
So we do have an
Sorry.
Yeah, we have an ongoing statutory responsibility. We have an ongoing statutory responsibility to monitor the government of the day's compliance with the once adopted emissions budgets and reduction plans. So by the end of this year, the government will have put in place emissions budgets out to 2035, and it will have adopted an emissions reduction plan. And then we get to report as an independent body on how they are performing against their plan. And we report that publicly. We must do it with a certain frequency under the Act, but there's no prohibition on us doing it at any time with any frequency. So that's the public accountability that we can, as an independent body, hold our elected leaders to account for.
Thanks, Rod. We've got 5 more minutes, so I'll wrap us up in a second. But we've just had a comment from Anne where she said, I'd like to point out that the business sector really started taking action on their carbon footprints when School Strike for Climate started having a good profile, and particularly after the big marches. So that's really good to hear. Does anyone have any closing comments before we round off? Ethan or Kelly, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I just had a quick thing, just sort of based off the whole discussion that we've had here for the past hour. I think it's important for everyone to know that no matter where you stand sort of across the population of Aotearoa or within society, everyone's voices are valued. In order for the Commission to be able to do their job and hold their end of the bargain, we need to be getting our voices through and sending in our submissions and our feedback to this report, because there has been a lot of discussions around this report publicly, and the feedback has been given publicly around whether people agree, whether they think the goals are too ambitious or not ambitious enough. So regardless of what other people think, and primarily what you think of this report, it's really important, obviously, for you to be able to get your voice heard. I know, as obviously being part of that youth sort of area within Aotearoa, it is what the actions that are made today, considering that this report holds goals all the way up to 2050, it is going to impact all of us completely severely, and it is going to impact future generations and our generation. So I think that now is the time that we really need to hold our end of the bargain and actually voice the concerns and the frustrations that we've had over the past few years since school strike really kicked off. So yeah, really use the opportunity that we have now highly, and making sure that your voices are heard.
Thanks, Ethan. So I've just popped a link to our consultation site in the chat, and we'd really love to hear from you. Thanks so much to everyone who's been on the call today and for your great questions. It's always really good to hear what you've got to say, and thanks so much to our panelists for providing your expert feedback and comments. So before we close off for the day, I'm going to ask Ethan just to close us out with a karakia.
Yep. Sorry, I think Kelly and I were going to alternate. I think Kelly's got a closing karakia for us.
Okay, over to you, Kelly.
Kia whakaaria te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, hunie, huie, tai kia.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Yeah,